Hey guys, this is the Academic Christian, also known as Chandler King. We're on this channel. We look at things from an academic perspective, a research-based perspective, a scientific perspective, and a biblical perspective. I cannot talk today, apparently. um, so we're here with another video. This is more of a topic video, and it's opinion video. I can have scriptures to back up my claims if people in the comment sections ask. But I'm going to start a new series just for the next week. And it's going to be dealing with how Christians and atheists should interact with each other and how we can have better dialogue between each other. And so right here, I'm going to do something where it's going to be what you should do if a friend or a family member loses their faith, how you should react. And I think oftentimes we as Christians can kind of get caught up into something because with our viewpoint, we believe if someone doesn't believe that Christ, died and resurrected, we obviously sometimes take, excessive action. And a lot of it's because a lot of people know that those who don't believe don't get to go to heaven. And so I'm going to show what I would personally do if there was someone who was very close to me came up and told me that they didn't believe anymore. And this is an interaction that, I'll be honest, this is from, my perspective. I'm looking at someone else's perspective too, but it may not be the right thing. And so I'm just going to do based off of someone who's not a pastor, someone who is just a college student, someone who has graduated from college, getting their master's degree. This is how I would just interact with someone who's basically is in a secular community. So I'm excited to get this started with you guys, and let's get to it. So before I get started, I can't say that this is all my own doing. I did watch an atheist YouTuber and a Christian YouTuber dialogue, and this is some of the stuff that they had to say too. But I'm going to add my own stuff to it as well because I'm not just going to take from it, even though it was a brilliant dialogue between them. I'm going to add to it because I think that there were some things that needed to be added. One of the first things that I believe that a Christian ought to do, if you're a parent, and I can't speak from this experience because I'm not a parent, and nothing wrong with it. I do want to be a parent someday, but I'm focusing on my academic career right now about getting higher degrees. I just want to be able to give the best life that I could to my future children. That aside, what I would do if I had something like my child came up and said that they were questioning God, that they didn't believe, or I had a very close friend of mine who comes up and says that they don't believe. I actually had who was someone who was a former friend of mine, and nothing bad ever happened between us. They moved to a whole different state. We lost contact with each other. There was no bad blood between us. But they actually did tell me that they didn't believe. They were someone back when I went to community college. I started off my academic career at a community college. I went and got my bachelor's at a 4-year. I'm about to finish my master's degree. I'm over halfway through it, and then I'm going to get my doctorate. But one of them, they saw and they know that I was a big Christian. And they were struggling with their faith. They were like, okay, all this and all the steps in here isn't exactly what I did, and I probably would use this a little more. But there was one thing I told them, and it was, dude, I love you regardless. And I did see this posted between a dialogue between a Christian and a person who is an atheist. They were saying the very first thing you should do is show them and tell them that you love them. And so I put in there, don't add anything negative to it. A lot of times we as Christians are like, hey man, I love you, but X, Y, and Z. We can easily go off onto a tangent and be like, hey man, this is why you should believe. This is everything. And you can get into it. But the thing is, and I'm going to put this in another slide, love is not forced. And so my thing is this, you show them that you love them, and it's shown through your actions too, but you love them. You say that you love them, and it's important to express to them that they were very brave. I didn't do this in my encounter, but this was something I saw from a dialogue here, is that you tell them that they're brave in doing it. A lot of people who are atheists, and I can't speak from everyone's experience, but there was a time I questioned God. There was a time that I went off, and a lot of it had to do with I was going through a rough time, and it was during the time that it was my transitioning from my community college to my 4-year college. I had some things happen, and I started to question God a lot. And luckily, of course, I had a supportive community that always loved me regardless. But what I couldn't have imagined if they acted a certain way like some Christians treat some atheists. And I'm not saying all Christians do this, but what I'm saying is tell them that they're brave for doing it, for admitting it. It's brave because a lot of atheists are in an environment where maybe they had parents that denounced them, maybe that they had parents that maybe weren't so supportive of the decision. And you could see maybe why, because you're worried about your own child, but at the same time, people have their own mind and you can't force anything. And so my thing is, you got to tell them, hey, it took a lot of courage for you to come up here and say that to me. It took a lot of courage. And I want to say that basically, I love you. This was another thing. I basically said the same thing earlier. Love is not forced. You tell them that you're happy to talk with them. The encounter when I was talking with someone who was an atheist years ago, I basically told them that, look, I love you, and I just basically said, if you want to talk to me, talk to me. I didn't quite say, everything here because, again, I'm looking at different perspectives. I looked up some stuff of some dialogues, and I'm really spreading a good message that someone else said. Um, I mentioned again, love is not forced. What you ought to do is set boundaries. I never did this beforehand. I just told the dude, look, I'm happy to talk to you if you want to talk to me about it. And we had some amazing discussions. And by the end of it, he ended up becoming someone who is more of an agnostic. Once he moved away, I lost contact. And it's probably a regret that I kind of share, but he was always kind to me. And he had some, and I've seen this from people who are atheists. Sometimes they've had such a rough situation with something that might have happened in the church, and it caused them to kind of deconvert in a way. And a lot of people that are Christian might say, hey, if they deconverted, they were never Christian to begin with. I don't necessarily believe that. I think that you can lose your faith in God. And I, went to a period where I did question God, which is probably why it kind of hits home in a way. But I think that, how do I put it? Regardless, I think it's very impactful because those were people that could have been very close with God. So what you really ought to do is you set boundaries. Just say, if it was me in the situation, I'd be like, all right, I love you, and look, you're very brave for telling me this, and I'm ready to talk, or I'll talk to you whenever you feel like it. If you have any questions, anything else, and just tell them that, whenever you want to bring something uh, before me, and we don't have to do this now, but set boundaries. Just say, hey, I'll be willing to love, I love you. Nothing will change that. Nothing will. And just say, look, if you want to talk to me ever, I'll talk with you, and we can have some boundaries set up so we don't lose this loving relationship that we already have with each other. All right. So some of that stuff I had too. I've experienced some of it, but I also took some viewpoints I saw from an atheist and a Christian YouTuber when they were in their dialogue. But here is my own thing that I'm taking from my own experience. When you talk with them, be loving, kind, and encouraging. Explain your viewpoint. I mean, everyone, you believe something based off the Bible because you're Christian. And we all have some form of belief from the scriptures. And when you do it, be loving and kind. Don't be forceful. Don't be like, hey, and a lot of times it can get into a very heated argument depending on if the Christian may have said something in a certain way, or maybe the atheist did. And so it's a big thing to do that, of course, you should never back down from whatever you believe based off the scriptures. You should be loving, kind, encouraging. Um, you should be willing to say what you believe is right and wrong. God is very evident in the Bible of what that is. And at the same time, you need to remember your boundaries. If there comes a time where something's happening, and it happened one time with me with a discussion with someone else who didn't believe, it started to become this thing, a heated discussion. And sometimes just because you're winning something in a discussion doesn't mean that you're winning. And what I mean with that is that it's not a debate. This is you love and talk to people, and so sometimes it shouldn't be like, boom, I'm out to defeat this person. That's not what this is at all. Now, like, let's say you have YouTube debates all the time, and if you're in a debate, okay, it's a debate. It is what it is. But if you're really trying to convert someone, or I wouldn't say convert, but share the gospel so God can touch their heart. Remember the boundaries you set. Remember again how I said earlier, love is not forced. So with these boundaries, remember that if there comes a time where y'all are going back and forth and all that, you need to be the bigger person and be like, hey, I'm sorry it got like this, and we set some boundaries, and I would rather not lose this relationship with you. And say, look, again, I'm willing to talk to you whenever you feel like it, and we can have this discussion again. And I love you, and I would rather salvage this relationship. And that's just one of the most important things, is because even though we're not guaranteed tomorrow, you can lose the person. Even if you win an argument, even if you do this, it does nothing if you lose the person. And it's one of those things I think where we as Christians sometimes fall short. And I do think some atheists fall short too. I think that sometimes, depending on the person, you can't put everybody in a box. But what I've noticed is a lot of Christians, here's the problem I see on both sides. Some Christians can be very judgmental, and some atheists can be very, how do I put it? They can be very arrogant, some of them. Not all of them. Because, again, we can't put Christians and atheists into one box because, again, not everyone has the same journey. The biggest thing, and again, this is an add on, if you're a Christian and you're trying to touch someone who is an atheist heart, you model your faith and be like Christ. And so that's the last point I have on this. You've got to understand that we live in a world, even though we're not perfect, we are called to uphold, be like Christ, and walk the same walk he did, even carry our own metaphorical cross, which means is we should be loving regardless of the scrutiny we may face. And this is the thing that I see a lot of Christians fail at. And you sit there, you see these people who are pastors and stuff like that getting fired or put in jail because they did these things that are wrong. And don't get me wrong, God is loving and forgiving. But that begins to weigh on people who are questioning God because they're like, oh my gosh, my leader in my faith community is doing this and they've done that. Forgiveness, you have to try your best to try turning your behavior around if you truly are forgiven. And I can't act like I am this perfect person. I'm not. I'm very far from it, but I do try my best. And so the most important thing is you model your faith like Christ. You try to be kind. And this is something I've always noticed. Christ was always harder on the people who believed than the people who didn't. Now, don't get me wrong. God called out what was right and wrong. And what I mean by that is and I mentioned this in a video where I was very critical of someone, that we were talking about how the Pharisees were trying to stone this lady, and he said, of course, he without sin cast the first stone and everything. And a lot of people take that as that, oh, you shouldn't be judgmental. Christ, at the very end of that time, said, is there anyone who stands against you? And she said no. And he told her, go and sin no more. So don't get me wrong. If there's someone doing something wrong, you can call it out in a loving and kind way. But there's a way to go about things, what I've always said. And that's part of what we as Christians, I feel, have failed about. We'll sit there and we'll be strong, like, hey, it should be like this. I don't necessarily believe that. You be kind about it. The only time Christ was real critical, where he was calling people names, was if it was the Pharisees or if maybe someone who was an unbeliever did something horrible. Like he said something bad about Herod. I would have to look up in the scriptures. But Herod was the reason John the Baptist got beheaded. And so a lot of Christians sit there and they're like, well, sin. I honestly believe some sin's worse than others. And people are like, but doesn't sin mean death? And all that. I believe that it's very evident, and you see it in the scriptures, that Christ is more critical of certain sins. And even in the Old Testament, God was more critical of certain sins, and the loss of life is one of the things he was most critical of. And so that was an example. But for the most part, be loving, model your faith, go out there and try to do your best to help others. I just want to say that's all I got to say. Peace out. Short video. Love you guys. There's going to be more to it. You do not want to miss it. Like and subscribe so you can keep up with the content.